Well, I don't see it like that. I mean, I feel like that as long as there's life, there's hope. That's my faith.
She was 60 years old, stood up in the middle of the pavilion, picked up the microphone, looked right at him, and she said something that almost nobody else in that room had the nerve to say that day. I feel like as long as there is life, there's hope. That's my faith. Armed guards were already passing out cups. Babies were being brought forward by their mothers. And this woman, 60 years old, a county clerk, had been in Jonestown for less than 10 months. She was the only one who spoke up. Hey guys, welcome back. Okay, so I've been researching this case for a long time, and honestly, I cannot get this woman out of my head. If you've followed true crime for any amount of time, you know the name, Jonestown. You've heard don't drink the Kool-Aid, everybody has. But here's the thing nobody talks about. Before Jim Jones killed 909 people in a jungle, before anyone called him a monster, he was considered a civil rights hero. In January 1977, he was handed a Humanitarian Award named after Martin Luther King Jr. 1 year before the massacre, 68% of the people who died that day in Guyana were Black. 304 of them were children under 18. And the man who led them there had been praised by Rosalynn Carter, Walter Mondale, Willie Brown, Jane Fonda. Powerful people, famous people, people who should have seen it. So today we're going deep into this case. Not the greatest hits version. The version about the two women who tell you everything you need to know about how this actually happened. One who stood up, one who didn't. Both died in the same 45 minutes. Let's start where it all starts. A town called Lynn, Indiana. 1934. The Great Depression. Jim Jones is 3 years old when his family gets evicted and moves into a shack with no plumbing, no electricity, and you have to understand something about Indiana at that time, because this matters for everything that comes next. In the 1920s, about a decade before Jones was born, Indiana had the most powerful Ku Klux Klan chapter in the country. Historians estimate roughly 1/3 of native-born white men in Indiana were Klan members at the peak. In Indianapolis alone, Klan membership was about 23% of the adult white male population. Jim Jones grew up in the exact kind of small Indiana town where that membership ran the deepest. His father, a disabled World War I veteran, was reportedly a Klan member himself. A journalism professor who grew up in Lynn later confirmed that publicly. So that's the environment. Then there's his mother, Lynetta, and she's a whole nother story. Neighbors described her as a tough-talking loner, a woman with no maternal instincts. His father was sick and mostly absent in hospitals. His mother worked constantly, didn't really want to, so Jim was left alone, a lot. The biographer Jeff Ginn wrote that his mother taught him 2 lessons early. 1, there was always some them out to get you. 2, reality was whatever you decided to believe. Read that again. Reality was whatever you decided to believe. That's the psychological foundation of everything that happens later. This is a kid whose first worldview came wrapped in 2 ideas. Enemies are everywhere, and truth is a thing you make up. The neighbors in Lynn remembered him as a really weird kid, obsessed with religion, obsessed with death. He would collect dead animals from the side of the road and hold mock funerals for them in his backyard. At least one neighbor reported that he killed a cat so he could preside over its funeral. There's a quote from a man named Lewis Thomas who lived nearby in Lynn. Thomas said he indeed had found his calling at that young age. I recall he could frequently be heard from the pulpit. It made no difference that he had no audience present. One day Thomas said no, refused to be the audience for a sermon, and Jones, a child, violently threw a rock at him, hit him in the temple, Thomas's exact word. That ended the conversion attempt. Kids picked teams for games. He was picked last. So he'd break up basketball games to deliver sermons. When neighborhood kids played war, he always volunteered to play the role of the Nazi. Not because he didn't understand what that meant, because he did. By the time he was in high school, he was reading everything. Stalin, Marx, Gandhi, Hitler, studying them, comparing them. What he was really studying was how a single person could control a massive group of people. Years later, reflecting on his childhood, he said this: I was ready to kill by the end of the 3rd grade. I was so aggressive and hostile, I was ready to kill. Nobody gave me love, any understanding. I didn't have any love given to me. I didn't know what the hell love was. He didn't wake up one day and decide to become what he became. Every person who knew him in Lynn described the same pattern. The signs were there, people saw them, they just didn't have the vocabulary to name them. Okay, so here's where the story gets complicated. Because when Jim Jones went off to Indiana University, then to Butler University, and started working at a hospital in Richmond as an orderly, he started doing something almost nobody else in Indiana was willing to do in the 1950s. He started fighting segregation. And I want to be really careful about how I say this next part, because what he did was real. What he accomplished was real. And at the same time, every person who knew him well later said the same thing. He didn't do it because he believed in it. He did it because it worked for him. 1952, he becomes a student pastor at a Methodist church in Indianapolis, starts trying to integrate black members into the congregation. The church doesn't go for it. He's eventually pushed out. 1955, he founds his own church in Indianapolis, calls it People's Temple. And what he builds there is genuinely unusual for the time. It's one of the only fully integrated congregations in that part of Indiana. Black and white families worshiping together, a soup kitchen that serves nearly 3,000 meals a month, nursing care for the elderly, programs for the poor. In 1961, he and his wife Rosalynn become the first white couple in Indiana to legally adopt a black child. They named him Jim Jones Jr. That same year, the mayor of Indianapolis appoints Jim Jones to chair the city's Human Rights Commission. And during his time there, he helps desegregate the Indianapolis Police Department, the telephone company, restaurants, a movie theater, an amusement park, and the Methodist Hospital. At an NAACP meeting during that period, he got up on the stage and told the crowd to be more militant, ended his speech with, "Let my people go." They gave him a standing ovation. If you stop the story here, Jim Jones is a genuine hero, a white pastor in the deep Midwest, putting his career on the line for racial integration, a man who adopted Black, Korean, and Native American children at a time when his neighbors were still in white hoods. But here's what the historians will tell you. When Jones was later asked, in private, why he cared about race, he never gave a principled answer. He talked about his childhood, about being an outcast, about identifying with the underdog, about being seen as, quote, the trash of the neighborhood. His civil rights work wasn't coming from a moral center. It was coming from the same place every other thing he did came from. Control, recognition, a need to be the person at the center of the room. He found a real injustice, a real movement, a real group of people who needed someone in power willing to stand up for them. And he inserted himself into the center of it. Same pattern he ran on his mother. Same pattern he ran on his wife. There's a story about his wife, Rosalynn. She was a Methodist. Real faith. Jones would argue with her just to prove he could change her mind. One week, he'd convince her God wasn't real. Next week, convince her God was real after all. He wasn't testing ideas. He was testing her. Constantly. That's the man. That was always the man. 1965, he's worried about nuclear war. He reads an article that says a town called Ukiah in Northern California might survive a nuclear attack. He packs up about 140 followers and moves the whole church west. By the early 70s, People's Temple has branches in San Francisco and Los Angeles. Membership hits around 3,000, and most of those members are Black. That's important. Hold on to that, because what happens next is the strangest turn in the entire story. Jim Jones, small-town Indiana preacher, becomes one of the most politically powerful religious figures on the west coast of the United States. And the reason is simple. He could deliver votes. A lot of votes. People's Temple could put 2,000 people on a street, at a rally, at a polling place with as little as 6 hours' notice. Mayor Art Agnos of San Francisco said it later, plain as day. If you were having a rally for a presidential candidate, you needed to fill up the crowd. You could always get busloads from Jim Jones's church. And that's when things got strange. Because if you're a politician in 1976, running for something in the Bay Area, and there's a guy who can hand you 2,000 bodies on demand, you do not ask questions. 1976, presidential campaign. Jimmy Carter's running mate, Walter Mondale, lands at San Francisco International Airport. A small group of dignitaries is invited onto his private jet for a private meeting. Jim Jones is one of the people on that plane. Later that year, Rosalynn Carter has a private meeting with Jim Jones at the Stanford Court Hotel in San Francisco. According to accounts from the time, Jones showed up with a security entourage larger than Rosalynn Carter's own Secret Service detail. Let that one sit. The future First Lady of the United States traveled with fewer armed men than a San Francisco pastor. After Jimmy Carter won the election, Jones got invited to the head table of the Democratic Convention dinner. Sitting next to Rosalynn Carter, she would later write him a handwritten letter. On White House stationery, this is public record. Your comments on Cuba have been helpful. I hope your suggestion can be acted on in the near future. Now here's the endorsement that gets me. A San Francisco assemblyman named Willie Brown, who later became the mayor of San Francisco and who, years later, was a political mentor to a lot of California politicians you still see on TV today, introduced Jim Jones at a rally in 1976 with this line. He called Jones a combination of Martin Luther King, Angela Davis, Albert Einstein, and Chairman Mao. Think about what that sentence is actually doing. He's saying this guy is the civil rights leader of our era and the revolutionary voice of our generation and the intellectual giant and the head of the state. All four, simultaneously, one man. In a letter to Fidel Castro around the same time, Willie Brown described Jones as a close personal friend and a highly trusted brother in the struggle for liberation. That is on paper. In an archive, you can go look it up right now. Dianne Feinstein, who decades later became a United States Senator, joined the San Francisco Board of Supervisors in formally honoring Jim Jones for, quote, his guidance and inspiration in humanitarian programs. Governor Jerry Brown visited People's Temple personally, spoke from the pulpit, praised Jones by name. Mayor George Moscone appointed Jones to chair the San Francisco Housing Authority Commission. Jane Fonda, that Jane Fonda, issued a written endorsement. She said People's Temple set a high standard of ethics and morality. And then, in January 1977, the moment that still kills me, Reverend Cecil Williams, pastor of Glide Memorial Church, a legitimately respected figure in the San Francisco Black community, presents the Martin Luther King Jr. Humanitarian Award to a group of recipients: Bob Niezda from Public Advocates, Mac Lyons for the United Farm Workers, a group Cesar Chavez started, Dr. Carlton Goodlett, publisher of The Sun Reporter, and Reverend Jim Jones of People's Temple. There's a photo. You can find it. 4 men on a stage, holding plaques bearing the name of the most important civil rights leader in American history. Jim Jones is on the far right, smiling. Exactly 22 months later, he would give the order to poison 304 children. When people talk about Jonestown like it came out of nowhere, like nobody could have seen it coming, I want you to keep that photo in mind. Everybody who mattered was in that room. Everybody with political power had a relationship with this man, and the people who would die in that jungle a year later were not following some fringe backwoods preacher. They were following a man their own leaders had told them was on the side of the angels. So let's talk about what Jonestown actually was, because the word has become so famous, so shorthand for cult gone wrong, that I think a lot of people don't really know what the place was like from the inside. In 1977, a magazine called New West published an investigation into People's Temple, former members talking on the record, accounts of beatings, accounts of members being forced to sign over their homes, their savings, their paychecks, accounts of humiliation rituals during services that could last until sunrise. Jim Jones knew the article was coming, so before it dropped, he moved. He took roughly 1,000 followers and flew them to a remote jungle in the South American nation of Guyana, to a settlement he had been quietly building for years. People's Temple Agricultural Project, or as everyone would soon call it, Jonestown. The pitch was a socialist paradise, a place where Black families could live free of American racism, free of poverty, free of the surveillance Jones was convinced the U.S. government had put him under. A promised land in the jungle. 68% of the people who went were Black. A lot of them were elderly. A lot of them were grandmothers who'd spent decades working domestic jobs in California and who were now sending their Social Security checks to the commune to help build what Jones promised would be their final home. Here's what they actually got when they arrived. Their passports were taken, their medications were taken, mail in and out of Jonestown was screened and rewritten, radio calls to family back home were scripted in advance. They were working 6 days a week, 6:30 in the morning to 6 at night, hour for lunch. That was the generous part. This wasn't paid work. You worked in order to get housed, in order to get fed. That was the arrangement. Jones said this to one of his most trusted assistants. It's in the records. Keep him poor and keep him tired. They won't have the energy to plan or leave. That's the sentence. That's the whole design. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. They told the residents the guards were there to protect them from outside attack. In reality, the guards were also there to stop anyone from walking out. Armed guards who are both your protectors and your captors. That's not a paradise, that's a prison with a nicer word on the sign. There were loudspeakers throughout the compound, Jim Jones talking almost around the clock, reading news or his version of news. telling the residents that America had collapsed into race war, that concentration camps were being built for black people, that the outside world was ending. None of that was true, but nobody inside could verify anything because Jones was the only news they got. If your entire information system is one man and that man is lying, you're living in his reality whether you know it or not. And this is where I need to introduce a detail that I want you to hold on to because it's going to come back later in a way you won't expect. There was a phrase Jones used on the radio, a code phrase, that the residents of Jonestown understood to mean one specific thing. We're going to visit Mr. Frazier. That was the code. And the meaning of that code, according to every survivor who's testified about it, was revolutionary suicide. It was the signal that the mass suicide plan was happening for real. Because Jones had been rehearsing it. For months, he called them White Nights. Followers would be woken up in the middle of the night, handed a cup of dark liquid, told it was poison, told they had to drink it to prove their loyalty. They'd drink, they'd wait to die. And then Jones would announce it was a test. Over and over, month after month, desensitizing 1,000 people to the idea of killing themselves on his command. When the real day came, the muscle memory was already there. They had already done this. They just hadn't died yet. During these months, Jones was falling apart. He was addicted to barbiturates. A doctor at Jonestown, named Larry Schacht, had been spending months developing the actual chemistry of the suicide cocktail. Potassium cyanide mixed with tranquilizers, mixed with a powdered drink called Flavor Aid to mask the taste. Members of the inner circle were still asking him in the last weeks if there was any way to make it taste less bitter. Those are the kinds of conversations happening inside this place. Engineering the flavor of the drink that would kill 900 people. And Jim Jones, himself the leader of all of it, had stopped even pretending to believe in God. He would stand in front of his congregation and say things like, "I am whatever you want me to be. If you want me to be your friend, I'll be your friend. If you want me to be your father, I'll be your father. If you see me as your God, I'll be your God." That's the level of delusion. That's the man at the top. Okay, so that's the place. That's the machine. Now I want to tell you about two women who were inside it. Because if you understand these two women, you understand everything about how something like Jonestown actually works, how it pulls people in, how it holds them. The first woman is Annie Moore, 24 years old, white, from California. She had joined People's Temple in 1972, right after she graduated high school. She was a registered nurse, smart, witty, irreverent. Her older sister Carolyn was already in the temple and was, by that point, Jim Jones's longtime mistress. Carolyn had a son with Jones named Chemo. So Annie wasn't just a member, she was family adjacent to Jim Jones himself. And by the time she got to Jonestown, Annie had become his personal nurse. She was the one administering his barbiturates. She was the one watching him sleep. There's a note Annie wrote to Jones, undated, found in the temple records. It says, "I do not mind being your nurse, and there is nothing more I would rather be. You should not feel guilty for having me watch you. I would rather be around you than anyone else in the world." 6 years in. Complete devotion. The second woman is Christine Miller, 60 years old, black, born in Brownsville, Texas in 1918. She'd worked most of her life as a county clerk. She lived in Los Angeles before joining up. And unlike Annie, Christine had arrived in Jonestown very late. She got there in early January of 1978, which means by the final day, Christine had been on the compound for about 10 months, not 6 years, 10 months. And that matters psychologically. Because the people who had been there longest were the ones most deeply committed to Jones's reality, the ones who had given the most. And once you've given that much, you can't admit you were wrong. That's not a character flaw. That's just how the human mind works. The more you invest in something, the harder it is to tell yourself the thing you invested in was a lie. Annie had 6 years of that investment. Christine had 10 months. And according to researchers who've studied her, Christine had a history of standing up to Jones. Not loudly, not dramatically, but consistently. She refused to be intimidated. She kept her own mind. She was, in a community built on erasing individuality, a woman who stayed herself. Researcher Michael Bellafontaine wrote this about her. He said Christine Miller was going to be respected, and if Jim Jones didn't give her that respect, she would just as soon be dead. That's the kind of woman we're talking about. That's the voice you're about to hear on the tape. So hold those two in your mind. Annie at 24, deeply in, writing love notes to her leader. Christine at 60, newly arrived, keeping her spine, both living in the same jungle, both about to be in the same room, both about to have their lives end on the same afternoon. By the middle of 1978, back in the United States, a group called the Concerned Relatives had formed. Family members of people in Jonestown who couldn't get phone calls through, couldn't get letters answered, couldn't confirm their loved ones were alive. They started lobbying Congress. And one of the congressmen who listened was a Democrat from California named Leo Ryan. And I want to take a minute on Leo Ryan because Leo Ryan is one of the most remarkable people in this entire case, and the average person has never heard of him. Leo Ryan was 53 years old, 5 kids, a Navy veteran who had served as a submariner in World War II, a former high school history teacher, a former mayor of South San Francisco. In 1972, he got elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. But here's the thing about him. Leo Ryan did not do politician things. In 1970, when he was in the California State Assembly, he was the chairman of a committee overseeing prison reform. And to figure out what was actually happening inside California prisons, he used a fake name and had himself booked as an inmate into Folsom State Prison. He lived inside the prison just to see it. After the Watts riots in 1965, he took a substitute teaching job in a black neighborhood to see what conditions were like. He traveled to Newfoundland to investigate how SEALs were being killed. He was a public critic of the CIA when public criticism of the CIA got you a lot of enemies. This is a man who believed, to his core, that the job of a congressman was to go look at the thing with your own eyes. So when the Concerned Relatives came to him in 1978 and said Americans are being held against their will in a jungle in Guyana, Leo Ryan did what Leo Ryan always did. He got on a plane. He arrived in Guyana's capital, Georgetown, on November 14, 1978. With him were staff members, reporters from NBC, the San Francisco Examiner, the Washington Post, and several members of the Concerned Relatives. His legislative counsel was a young woman named Jackie Speier. She would survive this trip and, decades later, become a United States Congresswoman herself. On November 17th, Ryan and a small group flew into Jonestown. That night, the compound threw them a party, music, a reception in the pavilion, members of the temple smiling, dancing, telling Ryan how happy they were, all of it coached in advance. In the middle of this performance, 2 members of the temple saw an opportunity. A man named Vernon Gosney had regretted coming to Jonestown almost from the day he arrived, and that night, he slipped a note to NBC reporter Don Harris. The note said, "Please help us get out of Jonestown." It was meant for Leo Ryan. He'd mistaken the reporter for the congressman. As Gosney handed it over, a child nearby saw the exchange. The child yelled, "He passed a note! He passed a note!" That child's voice is what set everything that happens next in motion. The next morning, more people started coming forward, quietly, carefully, asking if they could leave with Ryan's group. Jackie Speier was taking statements from them as fast as she could. By mid-morning, it was clear this was not a few unhappy members. It was a real defection. And while Ryan is processing defectors, another woman in Jonestown is putting together her own escape plan. Her name is Leslie Wagner-Wilson. She's 22 years old. She has a 3-year-old son named Jakari. Her husband is Joe Wilson, the head of Jim Jones's security detail. Leslie had joined People's Temple at 13, 9 years of her life inside this. She had grown up in it. Her mother, her sister, her 16-year-old brother, her in-laws, her nieces and nephews, all 11 members of her extended family were in Jonestown with her. Leslie had already made the decision in secret that she had to get out. She had watched what Jonestown was doing to her son. She had watched the White Night drills, and she had made a plan with a small group to walk out, just walk, into the jungle. On the morning of November 18th, while Leo Ryan was loading defectors into a truck bound for the airstrip, Leslie Wagner-Wilson strapped her 3-year-old son to her back with a bedsheet. She had about 40 pounds of supplies, and she started walking. The plan was to reach a town called Matthews Ridge, 37 miles away, on foot, through dense South American jungle, with a 3-year-old in heat, with snakes and jaguars, and no idea if the guards would come after them. The group had mixed Kool-Aid with Valium for the children, to keep them quiet during the walk so the guards wouldn't hear. The specific irony of that detail is something I can't get over. Kool-Aid, sedatives to save the children. A few hours before Jim Jones would mix the exact same kinds of things to kill 300 others. Leslie would say later, "We exchanged phone numbers in case we died. I was prepared to die. I never thought I would see my 21st birthday." She was 22. The sentence she said wasn't hypothetical, it was math. She kissed her mother goodbye that morning. She didn't know it was the last time. She left behind her husband, her mother, her sister, her brother Mark, who was 16 years old, her niece, her nephew, who was 2, her in-laws, 11 members of her family. All of them would be dead by that evening. Meanwhile, back at the airstrip, Leo Ryan had a knife pulled on him by a temple member. Others wrestled the man down. Ryan was shaken but alive. He rejoined his group on the Port Kaituma airstrip, and they started boarding 2 small planes, a larger 19-seat Twin Otter and a smaller 6-seat Cessna that the embassy had scrambled to accommodate the extra defectors. Larry Layton was on the Cessna. Layton was one of Jim Jones's most loyal Inner Circle members, but that morning he had told Ryan he wanted to defect. Ryan was suspicious. Other defectors had warned him that Layton's change of heart didn't smell right, but there wasn't time to check, so Layton got on the plane, and at the same moment, a tractor pulled up to the airstrip. Armed men from Jonestown's security team jumped off. They opened fire on the group boarding the Twin Otter. Bob Brown, the NBC cameraman, was still rolling. His last footage is the last thing he ever filmed. Leo Ryan was shot more than 20 times. Bob Brown was killed. So was reporter Don Harris. So was photographer Greg Robinson. A defector named Patty Parks was killed trying to flee. Jackie Spire was shot 5 times and survived by lying still and pretending to be dead. On the Cessna, Larry Layton pulled out a handgun and started firing at the other defectors inside the plane, including Vernon Gosney, the man who had been pretending to defect. He had been sent to kill from the inside. His weapon jammed. Other passengers wrestled him down. Leo Ryan became the first and only member of the United States Congress to be killed in the line of duty in American history. 5 years later, President Reagan would sign a bill awarding him the Congressional Gold Medal posthumously. But that comes later. Right now, on a dirt airstrip in Guyana, 5 people are dead and 9 are badly wounded. And 6 miles away, at Jonestown, a voice came over the loudspeaker system. Everybody to the pavilion. Everybody now. The residents didn't know yet what had happened at the airstrip. They only knew the tone had changed. Roughly 150 miles north, in the capital city of Georgetown, a group of young men from Jonestown were together at a basketball tournament. Members of the People's Temple basketball team, including Jim Jones's 2 sons, Stephen Jones and Jim Jones Jr. Jim Jones Jr. was the director of communications on the security team. That's the specific title. Which means when the radio call came in from his father that afternoon, he understood exactly what he was being told. His father's voice came through on the radio, and his father said, "We're going to visit Mr. Frazier." That's it. That's the sentence. Remember that code, Mr. Frazier? Jim Jones Jr. later said this in an interview. "I knew what that code meant. That code meant revolutionary suicide. My first reaction was, there's got to be a different way. No, Dad, we've got to do something different." And his father told him, "No, you need to be strong. You need to be our avenging angels." His father wanted him to do it too. In Georgetown, he wanted Jim Jr. and the basketball team to find knives, piano wire, poison, whatever they could, and commit suicide there. Jim Jr. refused. Instead, he and his teammates ran to the United States Embassy in Georgetown. They banged on the doors. They told the guards something terrible was happening. They were trying to stop it. And the Guyanese soldiers stationed outside the embassy, having just heard about the shooting at Port Kaituma, refused to let them in. They just stood there, on the sidewalk, outside the embassy of their own country, trying to save the lives of their mothers, their siblings, their wives, their children, their friends, and nobody would open the door. Years later, Jim Jones Jr. said, "When people say basketball saved their life, I can literally say basketball did save my life." Because while he was banging on that embassy door, back at the pavilion in Jonestown, his father was recording a tape, a 45-minute audio recording. The FBI later labeled it Q042. The public came to know it as the death tape. This tape exists. You can find it online. I'm not going to play it here. I'm going to tell you what's on it, because you need to know. But the audio itself is one of the most disturbing documents in American history, and I want you to make your own choice about whether you listen to it. Jones opens by telling the congregation that the plane out of Port Kaituma is going down, that one of the people on board will shoot the pilot, that the cause is lost, that the outside world will come for them now, for their children, and that the only dignified option is revolutionary suicide. He frames it as protest. He frames it as an act of collective freedom. He calls it, quote, an act of revolutionary protesting the conditions of an inhumane world. That's the rhetoric. That's how he gets 1,000 people to line up. And then, about 20 minutes in, a voice, a woman's voice, 60 years old, a county clerk from Los Angeles, 10 months in the jungle. Christine Miller steps to the microphone and she says this, "I feel like as long as there is life, there's hope. That's my faith." She's quoting Jones's own past words back to him. That used to be one of his sayings. Now she's holding him to it. She asks him if there's an alternative. Maybe they fly to Russia. Maybe they seek asylum in the Soviet Union. Jones tells her that option is gone now because of what just happened at the airstrip. And then Christine says the line that honestly is the reason I'm making this video, but I look at all the babies and I think they deserve to live. Jones says, "I agree, but they also deserve much more. They deserve peace." And Christine answers, "We all came here for peace." And Jones, watch what he does here. Jones makes it about him. He says, "I've laid down my life, practically. I've practically died every day to give you peace." Then he says this, "Without me, life has no meaning. I'm the best friend you'll ever have." That's the line. Without me, life has no meaning. Listen to what that sentence is actually doing. He is telling 900 people that their own lives are only worth what he says they're worth. And because he has decided it's over, their lives are over. That is the entire architecture of the cult in one sentence. Christine doesn't back down. She tells him she's not afraid to die. She says, "I don't think you are either," which is a pointed thing to say to a man who is surrounded by armed guards while telling everyone else to swallow poison. She tries again. She reminds them, "When we destroy ourselves, we are defeated." She says that twice, 3 times. She keeps coming back to it. And here is the part that psychologically is the hardest part of the whole tape for me. Jones doesn't silence her, not directly. He doesn't have his guards drag her away. He lets her talk because he doesn't need to silence her. The community does it for him. You can hear it on the tape. Members of the congregation start yelling back at her. A man named Jim McElvain, who had only arrived 2 days earlier, scolds her for challenging Jones. He says, "It's over, sister. It's over. We've made that day. Let's make it a beautiful day." A woman's voice, not identified clearly, calls out, "Christine, are you saying that you think he thinks more of them than other children here?" Twisting her plea to save babies into a personal insult against Jones. The crowd cheers. Christine is not outmaneuvered by Jim Jones. She is outmaneuvered by the community, by people who had been there longer, who had given more, who could not at that moment afford to let her be right. Because if she was right, then their whole lives had been a lie, and they were about to die for a lie. That's the psychology I want you to sit with. Christine Miller didn't lose because Jones was powerful. Christine Miller lost because the people around her could not survive admitting she was correct. That's the bystander effect in its purest and most devastating form. Eventually, her voice on the tape fades out. There's a moment later where Jones confirms that, quote, "The congressman has been murdered." After that, you don't hear Christine again. Some researchers believe that's when she stopped arguing, when she realized there really was no alternative anymore. Jones orders the medication brought out, a large metal vat filled with grape flavor aid, laced with cyanide and tranquilizers. Infants and young children were brought forward first. Nurses used syringes to squirt the mixture into their mouths. There's a detail from that moment I have to tell you because the person who survived to tell it was a man named Tim Carter. Tim was ex-Marines. He was in the compound that afternoon. His wife Gloria was there. So was their 15-month-old son, Malcolm. Tim was sent on an errand by Jones's inner circle. Take suitcases full of cash, about $1.6 million to the Soviet embassy in Georgetown. The errand saved his life, but when he came back to the pavilion to say goodbye to his family, he found his wife already dying, and in her arms, she was still holding their 15-month-old son. Tim Carter said this years later. "He murdered my wife and my son, my sister, my niece, my nephew, my brother-in-law, my sister-in-law." That's how I feel about Jim Jones. He also said this about the afternoon itself. "I felt evil itself blow into Jonestown when that storm hit." Meanwhile, outside the pavilion, people who refused to drink were being rounded up. Roughly 100 people tried to resist, to escape into the jungle, to refuse the cup. Armed guards dragged them into ditches next to the buildings and shot them. This is why you'll hear the Jonestown death toll described sometimes as suicide, sometimes as murder, sometimes as both. Because it was both. Some people drank willingly, some drank under duress. A significant number did not drink at all. They were injected or shot or forced. A medical examiner who went to the compound later examined 200 bodies. Over 70 of them had injection marks. That is not the pattern of a mass voluntary suicide. That is the pattern of a mass murder with a suicide cover story. During all of this, Jim Jones himself was on the stage, chanting into the microphone, chanting one word over and over, mother, 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 mother. He was calling for his wife, Marceline. Marceline, who by some accounts had yelled at him that morning, "How can you do this?" She lived for her 9 children. 3 of them were in Georgetown, alive, playing basketball. The others were in Jonestown, dying or already dead. She was stuck between them. Jones reminded her, through that chant, that her children were going to die either way. She stopped fighting. When all of it was finally over, there were 2 people still breathing in the cabin behind the pavilion: Jim Jones and his personal nurse, Annie Moore. 24 years old, the woman from the beginning of this chapter. At some point, Jones laid down on a pillow on the stage and took a single gunshot to the head, self-inflicted, according to the autopsy. 900 people took poison on his instruction and died convulsing in the dirt, and the man who ordered it chose the quickest, least painful way out, on a pillow. Annie Moore stayed alive a little longer. She wrote a letter, several pages, in blue ink, and that letter is, to me, the single most disturbing document to come out of Jonestown, because it is, written in real time, the mind of a person defending the leader who is killing her family around her. Annie wrote, "Jonestown, the most peaceful, loving community that ever existed. Jim Jones, the one who made this paradise possible." She wrote that, with bodies on the ground outside the cabin. Jim was the most honest, loving, caring, concerned person whom I ever met and knew. And the very last line, written in a different color of ink, suggesting it was added at the very end, at the very last moment, signed in her own hand, says this: "We died because you would not let us live in peace." That's the sentence Annie Moore chose to leave behind. 6 years of investment, her whole adult life. She could not bring herself to say at the very end that the man had been wrong. She could only blame the outside world. She had to. There was no other option her mind could accept. Then she lifted the gun, and she ended her own life. She was the last person to die in Jonestown. If you want a single image that captures the psychology of this whole case, here it is. One woman, 60, dead in the pavilion because she tried to stop it. One woman, 24, dead in the cabin because she tried to defend it. Both gone by sundown. The final death toll was 918. 909 at Jonestown itself. 5 at the airstrip, including Congressman Ryan, 4 at the People's Temple House in Georgetown. 304 of the dead were children under the age of 18. Until the attacks of September 11, 2001, the Jonestown Massacre was the single largest deliberate loss of American civilian life in history. It was also, and this is the part that gets buried, the largest single loss of Black American civilian life at one event in modern American history. That fact rarely makes it into the documentary summaries. Leslie Wagner-Wilson was still walking through the jungle when it happened. She did not know yet. She wouldn't know until that evening. When she finally reached safety, she was told Jonestown was gone. Her husband, her mother, her brother, her sister, her niece, her nephew, her in-laws, all of them. Leslie said later, "I pray my family did not think I left them. Not a day goes by that I don't think about it." She would spend decades battling survivor's guilt, PTSD, drug addiction, homelessness. At one point, 2 years after the massacre, she held a gun to her own head. She did not pull the trigger for her son, Jakari. Jakari, the 3-year-old she carried on her back through 37 miles of jungle, the youngest survivor of Jonestown, grew up carrying something nobody that age should have to carry. He later struggled with the law. He is, as of the most recent public reporting, serving a long sentence in prison. The children of Jonestown kept paying long after the day itself. Back in San Francisco, the politicians who had spent years building Jim Jones up had a problem. Because the photographs existed, the letters existed, the endorsements on official letterhead existed, and now there were more than 900 bodies in the jungle. Rosalynn Carter's team moved quickly to minimize the connection. The Carter administration distanced itself from Jones after the fact. Dianne Feinstein kept moving upward in politics, and for decades, rarely had to answer questions about the honor she had voted to give him. Jerry Brown stayed governor. Willie Brown took a different path. At first, he wouldn't apologize. Famously, he said this about the other politicians who were suddenly walking back their endorsements. They all like to say, "Forgive me, I was wrong," but that's bullshit. It doesn't mean a thing now, it just isn't relevant. Decades later, in his 2008 memoirs, Willie Brown described Jim Jones, the man he had publicly called a combination of Martin Luther King, Angela Davis, Albert Einstein, and Chairman Mao as, quote, an obscure but charismatic San Francisco religious cult figure. Obscure, that's the word he chose. For the man who had delivered him 2,000 voters with 6 hours' notice, who had introduced him at rallies, who had received a public Martin Luther King Award in his city. Then, in the same memoir, Willie Brown wrote this sentence with a straight face. The enormity of the tragedy involving his followers makes one wonder how politicians and police failed to notice his sinister hold on people. One wonders. That's the verb he used. One wonders, as if he hadn't been the one on the rally stage, as if he hadn't written the letter to Castro, as if he hadn't been there. This is what bystander failure looks like. Not people turning away when they see something wrong, people turning away from what they themselves built, and then, later, claiming to have wondered how it could ever have happened. It happened because you held the door open for it. That's how. The bodies of the 909 had to be flown back to the United States. Some families couldn't afford to claim them. The unclaimed dead, more than 400 of them, were eventually buried together at Evergreen Cemetery in Oakland, California. It took over 30 years for a proper memorial to go up at the site. In 2011, that memorial was finally installed. 2 black granite panels with the names of every person who died that day carved into them, including, controversially, the name Jim Jones. Right there next to his victims, families sued. There were years of legal fights. As of this recording, his name is still on the stone. Look, I want to bring this back to where we started, because I think there's something about this case that people consistently get wrong, and I want to try to say it right. Jonestown is often told as a story about one evil man, a charismatic sociopath who brainwashed 1,000 people and led them to their deaths. And that framing is comforting, because it means the monster was singular. It means you would have seen it coming. It means you're safe. But the real story of this case is different. The real story is a boy in Indiana whose earliest lessons were someone is always out to get you, and reality is whatever you believe. A young preacher who learned that a real cause, racial justice, could be used as a stage for his own need to control. A charismatic adult who was, for years, publicly honored by the most powerful politicians in his state. The real story is 304 children, most of them black, buried in American soil, because a lot of people over a lot of years each made small decisions to not look too closely. A pastor who liked the votes, a senator who liked the endorsements, a first lady who liked the letters, a community that could not afford to let Christine Miller be right. I keep coming back to Christine, 60 years old, county clerk, 10 months in the jungle. She wasn't the bravest person in the world. She wasn't trained for this. She was just a woman with a little bit of distance from the machine who could still see clearly. She stood up. She said the babies deserve to live. She said as long as there's life, there's hope. And the community she was standing in front of, the people she was trying to save, shouted her down. Not because they hated her, because they could not in that moment survive hearing her. That's the part of this case that haunts me. It wasn't Jones that silenced Christine Miller. It was everyone else in the room, everyone who had too much invested to let her be right, everyone who had, somewhere along the way, chosen Jim Jones's reality over their own eyes. If there's a lesson in this case, and I usually don't like doing lessons, but if there is one, it's this. Everyone knew something. Nobody knew everything. That's how these cases keep happening. They don't happen because of one monster. They happen because 1,000 small looks away add up to 900 graves. Christine Miller's name is on that granite panel at Evergreen Cemetery in Oakland. Next to her, the names of the 908 other people who died that day. And next to them, the name of the man who killed them all. Leslie Wagner-Wilson's 11 family members are on that panel too. So is Tim Carter's 15-month-old son. So is Annie Moore, the woman who signed her own name to a defense of the man who was killing her sister. They're all in one place now. And they should be remembered, all of them by name. Leslie said something once that I think about a lot. She said, "Not a day goes by that I don't think about it." That's the sentence. Not a day goes by. That's the cost of what happened that afternoon in 1978. It is still being paid by the people who got out. Thanks for sticking with me on this one. I know it was heavy. If you've made it this far, do me a favor. The next time someone mentions Jonestown in conversation, the next time someone jokes about drinking the Kool-Aid, the next time the Jim Jones name comes up as a punchline, tell them about Christine Miller, a 60-year-old black woman from Texas who stood up alone and tried to stop it, who said the babies deserved to live, who was right, and who we are still, all of us, in some small way, failing to listen to. I'll see you in the next one. Be good to each other out there.